Good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to our webinar on guarantees of origin for electricity. Let's wait a few more minutes so that we have all the participants online. Right, let's continue. My name is Kaija Niskala. I'm the head of service in FreeGrid in the guarantee of origin services. We have two channels here today, a Finnish channel where we have more than 100 participants. In addition, we also have a channel in English with interpretation into English with more than 20 people participating. Now you have an excellent opportunity to participate in the webinar by using the chat, and at the end we will take a few comments and questions from there. This is our agenda. First of all, we will hear Outi Vilén from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment, and she will tell us about the Guarantee of Origin Act. After that, I will be telling you about the content of the new Geo standard. And then Joni Vuorela from Fortum Power and Heat, he will be telling about Guarantees of Origin System Review. And finally, Mervi Suni from the Energy Authority will tell us about guidance to cancellations. So once more, welcome, and let's start with Outi Vilén. Outi, please go ahead.
Thank you. So I come from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment from the Energy Department. Renewables is the group where we have now been preparing this new Guarantee of Origin Act. I'm happy that you're numerous online listening to this presentation. Let's move on to the next slide, please. I will explain first about the background for the reform of the Act. And after that, I will tell about the solutions that we have as for the national implementation of the directive, what we have done so far in general, but more in detail about electricity. And as for the background, so there was a need to reform the Act, and we have a new updated Directive on Renewable Energy adopted at the end of the year 2018. And it will be implemented until June this year, end of June this year. And as for the Renewables Directive, the main goal is to make sure that in the European Union area, renewable rate is high enough by 2030. In practice, at least 32% of about in 10 years' time should be of renewable energy sources. There has been a process in place, and all member states have been involved and given their comments, and thus we have been transforming our national energy and climate plans. And according to the plan, the Finnish renewable energy share by 2030 should be at least 51%. But there has been plenty of pressure as to raise this level ambition compared to what was already agreed, and then the update of the directive is already being planned. Hopefully this summer we will get the new text also to be viewed by us, and thus we can start the negotiations. Next slide, please. Furthermore, as for RED 2, so Renewable Energies Directive, some presentation briefly for you by the themes. It's a very wide scope directive. As for the guarantees of origin, there's only one article on Geos. Other points come permit procedures and self-generated electricity, heating and cooling, sustainable criteria, transport renewables, and also support schemes for renewables and how they will be opened up. So all in all, we have both points that are related to permits and such procedures are in place in order to promote the renewable energy source production in member states. But also, on the other hand, there are many other things that are there to create the harmonized framework for member states. As for the production of renewables will be supported, what kind of schemes are there, and how you can also calculate the share of the renewables in different member states. And the next slide explains to you about the scheduling for RED 2 implementation here in Finland. So as I said, the different themes have been parallel. Sometimes they have a different schedule for each. And you see here in the slide the couple last years. And then the implementation directive, the deadline is this year, June, by the end of June this year. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And how did we start to prepare for the national implementation in Finland? At the very beginning, we drafted a couple of studies as for guarantees of origin. There was by the Secretary, the Prime Minister's Office, we had a report on extension of guarantees of origin systems to gas. It was finalized at the end of the year 2019, and then early part 2020, our Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment also had the report on implementation options for the Geos system for heating and cooling. As for electricity, we don't have a specific report for that because the starting point was so different compared to gas and hydrogen and cooling and heating. Since we already have an operable national system in place, and of course there will be certain changes coming up to that. But the government's draft proposal, as for the new text, was being circulated for comments last July and August. And indeed, we did receive nicely comments on the paper. And based on that, we have now been finalizing the text to become the government's bill. And furthermore, let's now go through the obligations setting out by the RED 2 directive as for guarantees of origin. So the Geos system in the member state should be extended to gas, hydrogen, heating and cooling in addition to electricity. This is the biggest thing. And also there has been the request for all of the types of energy. The directive is now sort of stricter as for selling electricity. You have to have the cancellation taking place for the certification. Otherwise, there are no other ways to really do this certification. But otherwise, there is some leave for the member states to other types than electricity. The new part of the directive is that the countries of origin must comply with the standard covering Geos. And the standard today covers only electricity, but the update is now under its way. And Kaya is here to explain us more about this standard progress, which is not that simple, but there is a reform of the standard going on. I also highlighted on this slide another point, which is the fact that the member states must recognize Geos issued by other member states. And as such, it is nothing new. Of course, this is something that has already been done with the previous directive. We've done this, but it's good to note. But in the future, this is not only about electricity, but gas, hydrogen, and cooling and heating as well. And in particular, heating and cooling are very local products. But despite of that, regulation is the same. Member states must recognize all guarantees of origin issued by other member states. And there is no requirement saying that the physical transfer should be possible. Now moving to the next one, we have some general principles, nationally speaking, about the implementation here, and I will explain these now. And these cover all of them. So all forms of energy. I will explain further electricity related questions, but at the national implementation, we have decided that for all forms of energy, there will be an obligation to see the origin, so having certification. It's an obligation. We talk about certification obligation to certify sale and use. It covers all forms of energy, but there are certain exceptions. So certain exceptions to certain forms of energy that are needed, and they will be contained in the Act. And mainly these cover situations where you have small scale production or the transfer takes place in a way that we consider that it is for the customer very clear what is the source of the energy and what is the actual source of the energy. So the obligation as such It's about a situation when you are selling, or company says that they are now using this energy that is being defined with the guarantee of origin. The validity will be 12 months in the future as well. There was certain debate about RED 2 because it allows for 8 to 12 months sort of a scale for the validity of the GO. But we considered here in Finland, nationally, we have no need to change the practice. This is the practice we have had so far, so it is the validity period of 12 months in the future as well. The Geos will be issued to produce have received financial support in the future as well, but the market value should be taken into account in the new support schemes. And as taking that into account in the support schemes, the directive requires this to be in place unless a member state decides that they will not grant guarantees of origin to producers who already have a support scheme. But this is something that is not really causing us any changes to the present situation for producers. So the limitation is or let's say that the point is that we have the deadline validity period set out by the directive, and we follow that. For instance, you have production plants that receive a support scheme from the Energy Authority of Finland, and once the support has been granted prior to the national implementation of the directive, in that case, there will not be any changes taking place, even though this financial support will be giving out from the time when it's been granted. So the party who grants the support will take this into account. So only the decisions taking place after the implementation of the directive, investments or production schemes, if there is for a certain form of energy such a scheme that will be putting in place. So the party who is granting the support will need to make sure that the market value of the guarantee of origin is taken into account. And otherwise, here nationally, we have a more wider scope compared to the requirement made by directive. So the directive enables that we can also have guarantees of origin for non-renewable energy sources. So we have decided to use this opportunity provided by the directive. Therefore, GO can be also given to electricity produced by nuclear power and also for waste heat and waste cold. And equally, the certification obligation applies to this when you have to cancel the Geos. It covers all of these as well. As for the registrars, we in the future will have 3 of them in Finland. So Fingrid will continue in this position for electricity. So it's the registrar for Geos electricity. And then for gas and hydrogen, the party in charge is Gasgrid. And then for heating and cooling, it's the Finnish Energy Authority. And the Energy Authority will be also the supervisory authority in the future, as well as it has been so far. So it monitors compliance with the Act and the provisions issued thereunder. So therefore, the Finnish Energy Authority has a special dual role, so both being a supervisor and a registrar at the same time. And technically speaking of the law, the Act itself, so we're going to have a new Act. It's called the Guarantee of Origin for Energy, and it will repeal the other one concerning geographical origin of electricity. So because the major changes taking place, we did not want to make an update of the current act, but we will repeal that act and we'll have this new act in place. Next slide, please. And now we're moving to the details of Geos for electricity. I have a couple of slides for you about this topic. So here are the slides. And there is the obligation, and also I would like to say that in the future, it's not mandatory for all forms of production to get guarantee of origin, in particular resource or renewable energy sources. Then the obligation is not changing at all. It is the same as it was before, and the similar certification is now for electricity that is produced with nuclear power. But with nuclear power, since it's a new kind of guarantee of origin, the obligation would be taking into place at the beginning of the next year, so 2022. That is for nuclear power certification obligation. And the same goes also for gas and hydrogen and cooling and heating as for their Geos. So at the end of this year, we will just proceed with the renewable energy sources. Electricity shall be obliged to have a certification and with Geos. And as said, the Act itself, as the proposal is now, there are certain exemptions for certification obligation. And I've written down here the exemption for electricity. So the electricity user producing electricity for our own use from renewable energy sources, using electricity equivalent with nominal capacity less 1 MVA, and reports that in marketing that they are using electricity that is produced from renewable energy sources. So such producer and user of electricity, it has no need to certify and cancel the Geos if in the first place they did not apply for Geos for their production. So meaning that the Act, we saw in the Act that there might be some tricky, difficult situations coming up if ever you have such a case that you have a shopping center, you have the solar panels on the roof of the shopping center, but then if you want to, well, of course, comply with everything and would like to apply for our own production GOs and then cancel them. So there is an administrative burden which is perhaps out of proportion. Therefore, there is the exemption in place in the text. And hopefully this will alleviate and facilitate such a small energy production from the renewables in the future. We also recognize that there are EU countries and EEA countries that we need to recognize the Geos for both renewable and nuclear generated electricity. And this is something that is keeping the same statute or condition as we had in place so far as for recognition. So if, as it's for the accuracy, if it's reliable, accuracy and authenticity, if you have any doubts about that, then in that case, the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment can decide that for certain countries, the Geos issued by them cannot be recognized. But then moving on, a few words about next slide, which is about the residual mix. So it will be counted for electricity. And we also take into account the electricity with nuclear power and its certifications. The Energy Authority publishes the residual mix each year, so no change in there. End of June every year, they will publish this residual mix, but there is some alleviation by what is the deadline for the operators that must latest inform their residual mix. The current law says 2 months after its publication at the latest, but with this current text that is now being prepared, the comments were that it's been rather tight schedule, because the timeline is very much holiday period, July, August. Therefore, we have a prolongation of 1 more month. And hopefully, this will make things easier in practice. And there's another slide on the disclosure of origin of electricity. This one also has some changes that take place compared to the current Act. In other words, the information as for origin electricity must be provided either in the invoices or the appendices, as so far, but you have the alternative as well. So it's supplier's website or any other similar manner that is easily accessible to the end user. So invoice, appendix, if that explains where you can find the information, that is also the option now. So things have been made easier. So the information of the original electricity does not need to be always in the invoice. A division of energy sources is the same as before. A slight change is that I think the current Act talks about fossil fuels, including peat. And here the word peat is no longer in the headline in question. But of course, as such, peat is included under that. Furthermore, the only, as we're thinking of renewable energy sources, our nuclear power may be disclosed in the division. That is either the actual production method or using the residual mix published by the Energy Authority. So now nuclear power is also included in this as well. So fossil fuels produce electricity has the choice whether you give out the actual production method or the residual mix published. And then further preparation, a few words about this. Of course, in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment, we follow the update work of the standard. And if we have the resources in place, we try to join and participate in the update work. We have the government proposal, and the objective is we have the wish to give it to the Finnish Parliament this spring, this year. And we expect the act to enter into force end of June this year. And we do understand all that the timeline is very restricted, and it means that perhaps we are not, or for a long time, it's not such a long time until we reach the point of 30th of June, and we want this to be enforced by that time after the parliamentary process of it. So the objective is still the same. So end of June this year, we will have the act in place because, as said, that is the timeline given for the implementation of the directive. But at the same time, we are thinking, in particularly once the Parliament will take this into its proceedings, that we know more, and we will then talk with the registrar about this. What is the real timeline? For instance, what about some transition period stipulations, so that the new energy forms and the nuclear produced electricity certifications could be granted from this date on, but perhaps later in autumn or end of the year, so that the registrars will have enough of time to prepare their work so that they can really have the registers in place, or get them and have them functioning, or transform their current registers so that they can follow, and then grant, of course, the Geos. So this was my presentation. Thank you for your attention. And of course, if you have any questions, I am ready to answer. I think we have some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Outi. We have two questions from the audience. One is, are different GOs conflicting? For example, a GO for renewable energy, can you make heat production green with that? A good question. They are not interconnected with each other. We have GOs for electricity, for gas, hydrogen, heating and cooling. So when we think, for example, about gas, the GO is applicable to all gas products, irrespective of whether it's fluid or something else. So we do rely on that it's sufficient when it's GO for gas, and it's not interconnected or in discrepancy between different forms. And then we have another question that's in English. This GO, do you have to disclose it on a contract level for the supplier as a whole? I will read it to you in English. Will GO for electricity be disclosed on contract level or for the supplier as a whole? On a legislative level, on a statute level, which is prepared this spring, this is not something that we will regulate on. This is probably something that the Finnish Energy Authority can give instructions on. And if I remember correctly, the instructions currently are such that they need to be cancelled so that the seller is notified and is known, and on a legislative level, we will not regulate, or we will have no text on that. Thank you. And those were the 2 questions. And I would like to ask something. These nuclear guarantees could be issued when the law is in place, when the act is in place, despite the fact that they can only be used from the beginning of next year, or yes. Geos for nuclear power can be issued for production since the 30th of June. That's the idea. And of course, you can also, through that, certify your use of power during this year, but there's no obligation in act or in legislation this year for that, only from the beginning of next year. So, for example, if you sell electricity, which is nuclear power, so the only way to certify its origin is through a cancellation of Geos. Thank you for that. And then we have one more question. If you use Geo power, you need to apply for Geos for renewable production. Yes, in practice, this is the case. So this is what you would need to do in these situations, do this kind of energy conversion in the Geo system. So if we have, for example, or if we look at, for example, the production of hydrogen, and if you have, for example, wind power in the same site, so in these cases, it would be enough if the conversion was on the same site. So you would apply for a Geo only for the final product, but if electricity is taken from the grid, this is the case. And the idea in these energy conversions is that there are no standard coefficients. Instead, you would need to look at the actual production process and have that as a basis. And then based on that, you would also apply for cancellations of Geo. Right, thank you for this. We still have a few more questions from the audience. The transfer period for system, does it mean that from the 30th of June, these Geos will be issued retrospectively? This also concerns other forms of energy than electricity. Yes, and also electricity, these, for example, Geos for nuclear power, if it is not possible to update the register. So by 30th of June, it is possible to issue this, but this is exactly what we're thinking about when it comes to the new updated systems, that we would follow the directive obligation, which is by or starting from the 30th of June. But because the procedures have taken so long in the Parliament, we want to make sure that it's possible to start up the Geo register or to update it, that everybody, all the actors have enough time for that. Right, let's move on, and we can have or take more questions after all the presentations. So let's move on. Next, I will be telling you about the status report on the Geo standard. Next slide, please. Here's an overview of our guarantees of origin service. We have currently 46 account holders, and we did a customer satisfaction survey last autumn. Thanks to everybody who answered, we had a overall grade 4.4, which is really good. And this NPS, Net Promoter Score Index, was 51.1. amongst all respondents, and those who operate a lot with us gave us a really good score, which is 73.9, a really good result. And we also received a lot of open comments and ideas, and we have been looking at those and also taken some measures in order to develop our services. Here's also a reminder of our deadlines. Cancellations for 2020 must be made by 31st of March this year. Also, issuances for 2020 production should be made by the 31st of March. And also remember to fill in the fuel mixes for those production plants with several fuels. And we will be looking at a so-called API interface, meaning that the account holders would be able to use it through an interface. And we do hope that our customers would be interested in developing this together with us. And those of you who are interested, please let us know, get in touch so that we can start collaborating together and finding solutions that are good for us, that are also good for our customers, so that they can get more information through this new interface. Next slide, please. Here's a description of the baseline for the revision of standard. So we do have a valid standard called EN 16325 plus A1, and that is currently only for electricity, GO only for electricity. We have a diversified standardization model in Finland, and we do have a Finnish organization called METSTA, Mechanical Engineering and Metal Industry Standardization in Finland, which is responsible for example, coordinating the national work in the field of mechanical engineering and metals industry, construction, building, automation, and energy management, both on the European and international level. Our contact person in METSTA has been Tommy Carlson, and Tommy has helped us greatly with this standardization process and understanding it. How is it done and how do we administer the whole process? Next slide, please. The European Working Group for this standard EN 16325 was launched last year in February. The aim is to revise the standard and extend it to also cover renewable gas, hydrogen, as well as heating and cooling. In order to revise the standard, we have launched a working group 5, which is under a joint technical committee, and Tommy Carlson is the Finnish representative in this joint technical committee 14. We also have a national working group. I'm the chair of that, and Jouni Vuorela from Fortum Power and Heat has also participated in all these European working group meetings. In addition, we have Outi Vilén, Mervi Suni, and Roland Magnusson, Anni Nuppunen, and Sea Mittler, as well as Kati Takala and Mirja Tiitinen as members in the group. Next slide, please. The standard process is divided in 3 stages. We have the progress, the inquiry stage, and the formal vote. We're right now in the working group stage, in progress, and now experts have the best chance to influence the content of the future standard. And our Finnish group has been very active. We have made a lot of comments and have been very active and tried to influence in many ways in order for the standard to be as good as possible so that it can be applied in our conditions and circumstances in Finland. After the working group stage, we will have the inquiry stage, and that is actually the most important stage in terms of the content of the future standard. That is a possibility for national groups to submit both technical and editorial comments, And at the same time, votes are also cast on the acceptability of the proposal, whether it will be put to formal vote or not. A member state may apply for a national exemption if the national legislation differs from the standard. And to apply for this national exemption should be done at an early stage, that is in the inquiry stage. Well, if the standard goes to formal vote, then the voting is only either in favor or against the adoption of the draft standard. After the inquiry stage and formal vote, the votes are allocated in proportion to the populations of the member states participating in the CEN. So Finland's share is less than 1%. So therefore, it's extremely important that we can influence and have a say already in the earlier stages, so that we can have an influence on the things that are important for us. This is an estimate of the revision process of standard in the whole organization. So working group 5 is currently writing the standard text, and my working group, or the idea and the aim, is that the working group is or finds a joint stand and then sends that to the committee, and the JTC committee then works with these comments and then sends the draft back to the working group that will go through it, and then it will be sent to the committee secretariat. And after that, it will be sent to vote, inquiry stage voting. First, translations will be made in French and German, and about 12 weeks is allocated for that. And then it's possible to have a vote, which also takes 12 weeks. At this stage, inquiry stage, all national standard organizations have a possibility to have a say in all the different stages of the standard, whether they are in favor, whether they find it all right, or whether they are against something. And then after that, the working group 5 will collect all the national comments from each member country, evaluate them, and then there's working group work again, and we prepare a version that will be voted upon. And then translations are made, 5 weeks reserved for that, for all the formal languages. And then we have a final vote, which takes about 8 weeks. And then the final procedure, probably about 5 weeks. That's the estimate we have here. So this is, of course, only one estimate of the process, how the process will develop. It might take longer, it might take less. It depends, of course, on how much comments we get, how much time does it take to go through all the comments. This is an estimate that has been made by a working group chair from last autumn. It's slightly altered, but basically it's a proposal from a working group. And here's a draft standard that was presented last November, and that has also been sent to the committee unofficially. On the left-hand side, we see table of contents. Maybe the most important thing there is Chapter 4, generic rules for guarantees of origin for all energy carriers. And then we have Chapter 5, rules specific to individual energy carriers. We have electricity, energy, gas, hydrogen, heating and cooling. In a standard draft that has been subject to discussions in working groups. There are appendices, and for example, Appendix A is about energy source type codes, and then we have Appendix B, technology codes, C, coding structures, for example, the numbers for Geos, and then we have D, cogeneration, geo codes, uses of heat. And then we have been discussing Appendix E that would not be binding, and it's about sustainability criteria and carbon footprint. This is from the gas working groups. And then also we've been discussing Appendix F about different networks. But these are all still drafts that have been subject to discussions in working groups. So this is what the situation looked like in November last year. As for Finland, so in this generic working group, we have had Joni Vuorela from Fortum as our representative. I have been in the electricity working group. And then we've had Anni Nuppunen and Sea Mittler from Gas Grid Finland in the gas and hydrogen working group, and Outi Vilén, Joni Vuorela, Mirja Tiitinen have been in the heating and cooling working group. And next slide, please. We have had some challenges in the work of the working group 5. The revision of the standard is based on the FastGo project presentation, not the current standard. The proposal is very detailed, and we in the Finnish group felt that it goes too far when it comes to interpreting the directive, the RED directive. The working group has been looking at a number of things when it comes to new forms of energy. That is, for example, the electricity, hydrogen, gas, heating and cooling, and different forms of energy also have different expectations as to the content of Geo. There's a lot of discussion on whether Geo is only about renewables, or should it also include other qualities, either as mandatory or non-mandatory. And also the processing of the conversions between forms of energy. If, for example, we're talking about renewable hydrogen, this has not yet been described. And then the discussion we had last autumn, why was it challenging? It was challenging because we're talking, for example, about hydrogen in the natural gas network. Will the qualities of hydrogen remain in this treatment, or will it change when it's in the natural gas network? We have a national working group in Finland, and we have felt that it's really important that all production receives this GO, and that we, through national legislation, can ensure the reliability of the entire system. Next slide, please.
This work group, we had last year 8 meetings. And it was all about work which had some challenges. There were conflicting interests, quite a number of them. All member states are present, all the energy forms are present, and also have representatives very widely from different stakeholder groups. And as a consequence of all that, it was in November, December, when the secretary decided to ask for advice from the committee to see how we can progress. And they did establish an ad hoc working group where committee secretary was being represented and also working group secretary was being represented. And they set up a question that is now being directed to national organizations. So the question is the content of the standard. Should it have specific disclosure principles and geo cancellation rules for other energy carriers? So it means towards the end users. And should the Geos cancellation rules, as said, be written down into the standard itself for others, meaning new forms of energy, so other than electricity. So the point they wanted to make was that whether for gas and cooling, heating, hydrogen, you need to have the obligation to cancel and give the GO. Would that be in the standard itself? Because they're not in the directive. And the obligations for electricity are in the electricity market directive. As for the answer time, deadline was on Friday. And the answers were given out yesterday. And the answer is no to this question. There were 7 countries that voted against. So there was France, Germany, Italy, and the Nordic countries, including Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And there were 3 countries voting for: Luxembourg, Romania, and Spain. And the rest did not vote at all. So they did not express their view. So thus, it means that no is the answer to the question that was said. As a starting point, one can say that the subgroups will now continue their work, but for the next working group 5 meeting has not been agreed yet for the spring. Another question I would say is, what about the standard work? How can we now proceed with it? We're already in mid-February today, and we have, of course, in the situation quite hard time saying, will this standard be ready by the end of June or by autumn or next year? So there are different views in the discussions that have been expressed about this. We cannot now tell more specifically what the future will bring us. But of course, we shall inform immediately once we know about the process and when we know what the situation looks like this spring. So all in all, as said, I cannot give you more specific information on the timelines, but this is the current situation review as from the Finnish group's perspective. Thank you all for your attention. Do you have any questions? Or perhaps we could have a question that was written to when Oti was giving her presentation. It was about the standard. So Oti, you can also answer this question, please. Will Finland consider geosystem for energy efficiency targets? So I think the question was about geosystem and energy efficiency for that purpose. I'm sorry for the delay. I hope that you can all hear me now. I have 2 computers next to each other on my table, so my own PC and the webinar, so therefore I'm mixed with the mouses I'm using here. But this is what I understand, what the point was about the question, exactly whether this GO system will be applied also to energy efficiency. Personally, I have not heard of any such plan being out there. But of course, the Energy Efficiency Directive is going to be updated as well as its renewable sources and energy sources directive. So we don't know yet what are the possible novelties containing in that revised or update version. Okay. And what about you, Audrey? Furthermore, could you answer another point? We have been pondering about the question, how do we apply the GOs if the standard does not match this timeline, so it will not be ready by the end of June this year? Okay. So indeed, that is a question that we have been reflecting as well, and said it's more likely that it cannot be completed by that time compared to it being finished by the end of June. And now, as we think of the law, we have been preparing for this so that the Act itself has not any rule or an obligation. So no obligation to follow the standard, but it will be made by not by the law, but the Act that will be prepared this spring. That's the place for the text. Most likely, we will write the text in the format that, yes, we have the obligation to follow the standard of GO, but as said, since it's only for electricity now, then it will only cover the GOs for electricity at the very beginning. At a certain point later, when the standard revised version is adopted, then we will expand that to cover also hydrogen, heating and cooling GOs as well, and gas. So we have to have a look at that once we have the final standard text in front of us. So whether eventually that text will give us some transition period rules or not. As for the revised version, when it will be applied, or do we have a national need to have transition period in the Act in Finland? But as I said, we cannot express any view on that yet, since the final version of the updated standard is not known. Right, thank you for that. It is a quite peculiar situation, yes, but I would think that we will find out more about this during the spring. Yes, we hope so, indeed. Okay, do we have any other questions? I think there are a few questions here. What about if you're selling CO2-free, emission-free electricity? How about or guarantees for that? Should you have a guarantee? Well, in that case, I personally consider that yes, you have to have the guarantee because that the marketing claim has been made. It is CO2-free electricity, so it's very closely linked to the actual origin of the energy. So in that case, I would say, yes, you can do the guarantee through the nuclear powered electricity or renewables, because both are being CO2 emissions zero. So in that case, either one is suitable, but I would say that yes, you should have the guarantee. And if ever you want to be selling, say, locally produced electricity, that would be produced from raw materials that have been provided from a certain close by area, that could be then a type of marketing claim that you don't need to, and you can't really have the guarantee in place through GOs. Right. Okay. Thank you for that. And I think we can now continue with our agenda. So we're going to come back to the questions after the next couple of presentations. So our next speaker is Joni Vuorela. Please take the floor, Joni. Thank you. I hope you can all hear me well. I don't have mute on or anything like that. Can you hear me? Anyone? Kaya, anyone else? Yes, we can hear you well. Good. Thank you for confirming that. So my name is Joni Vuorela. I come from Fortum. And in 2014, I joined the company and this industry. And ever since, I've been working with Geos myself a lot lately. Indeed, as said, Kaya's presentation showed you, we are involved in the European questions, in the working groups, and we tried there to create the standard in a form that it's easy to interpret, for member states, and that the standard will enable also the different things set by the directive so that we have common European markets. But the perspective of my presentation is to give you a general overview of guarantees of origin. What do they mean? Why do we have the system? What is the size of the market? And what kind of market do we have? As for pricing and volumes, what we can expect in the future to see. And my presentation is very much based on electricity, because that has been the most important market for Geos so far. But I would say the same principles can be applied in the future for hydrogen and gas as well. But of course, all of them have their underlying specific market situation, so always dependent on how products being arranged. But still, the starting point is that my presentation is based on electricity, but you could think that it could be applied for also other forms of energy, other carriers. And in the company Fortum, we are a small group of people doing geo questions. That's me and my colleague Timo Mäkelä as well. We are the experts of the topic, and we have few individual resources that are also having other functions. But it's very compact organization of us that work on the geo questions at Fortum company. But we, of course, want to see ourselves as an expert of this question. But okay, let's move on with my presentation. So, what about these guarantees of origin? What does that mean? Of course, we've been talking about this in the seminar, and the standard is changing. But I will go back a couple of steps myself to explain you first the guarantees of origin. If you have listeners, we have listeners who don't know that much of this. It has been defined as an instrument by the directive. It is also a consumer protection good, in the way that sellers of electricity must announce and disclose the energy they provide for the customers, the end customers. So there are different levels for the obligations. Odi talked about this disclosure obligation that sellers have of electricity, but there is now an expansion of this that will also cover the users of electricity. But in the history, we know that this rather old instrument, created already about 10 years ago or more than that. The markets have been ever since pan-European, and it now has been reinforced by the previous package, strengthened rather. And this is now the next round, which is coming up, and we'll wait and see to see what is coming up. I can come back to that when I speculate on the future, what we might be expecting from the new package. So what does GO in the simplest form mean? It's a unique and individual certificate that is given to the producer, and the producer can sell it to consumers, who can then say, okay, where did this energy come from? So this is the same principle and idea that is underlying throughout the European Union area. We have a sort of a closed area in the European area where we have book and claim system implemented. So we know the products know what they produce into the system, and the consumers are able to go into the system to get their shares to their own products. And one thing that enables this EU market is the most important point, which is that it's tradable and transferable certificate. It is not transferable once, but you can multiple times transfer the certificate throughout its life cycle. And this, I would say, is the point that created the market for Geos. We don't have one direction only producer and consumer, but that you have between different counterparts, and the certificate can circulate like this. But the idea, of course, is easiest to think like we had producers and consumers who would be contracting on the marketplace. And the underlying point here, the second point, is that the energy streams or flows are detached from this. So we don't have to have a plug in between the two counterparts for them to be able to trade. But as I said, this is a pan-European electricity system as a whole, as one place. And once we know more about GEOs, so why do we want to use such GEOs? Traditionally has been for electricity producers and sellers as a branding tool. So you can create electricity products that are different ones. Usually, electricity is a gray product. Everything comes out from the plug. But Geo made it possible that we can have different categories in place. We can create some new residual or locally produced electricity from the windmill that is close by your area where you live, or solar energy products, so that you can create some colors into this and different brands for electricity. And also the electricity companies can indeed create these brands towards the consumers. And lately, one big trend has been that you no longer have electricity sales persons branding, but large companies already, they want to make these brands, create brands. So in supply, the idea is that you want to supply only renewables, and this has created further pressure to the market because of the demand. Demand is growing, and which is most welcomed as well. Naturally, for many companies, it is so important in their key strategy say that we only want to have renewables. And what is provided by Geo is that you can specifically only acquire electricity or energy product that is suitable for your own strategy. And this is indeed a major driver lately, particularly PPA systems and such. So there will be hydrogen strategy, I'm sure, in the future. An important point, if you have certain sort of conditions, what is a renewable you can use in the future. So the background idea for Geo is to protect the consumers. As I said, we have to be able to rely on it and trust the system. And therefore, Geos, as I said, is unique, individual certificate. And it's, from our perspective, the way to give a certification. It is a certification that has been created because of legislation and by the authorities supervising it. And since we have a reliable system in place, it of course means that we have this double counting electricity attributes that we can avoid. So for 1 megawatt hour, we only have one attribute, so 1 megawatt hour. And I think I already said this, but it is a lot to do with this current reporting systems where you use the GOs. And I would say that geo information that it should contain is rather known by all of us. So I have a list here on the right-hand side of the slide of this. And what about the possible new ones provided by the standard? So direct emissions, that what this the contains, or what about the network on the level of the network, the grid? These are open questions, so it is information level, but there's a lot of discussion on this. But currently, from the geo perspective, electricity perspective, which is only based on renewables, the information on the emissions is not that relevant because we talk about renewable sources and it's direct emissions, so it's always zero. So in this regard, it's there, but the question that's open is only direct emissions, or is they're going to be talking about life cycle emissions, which is much more of a complex question. But currently, these are the ones, what Kaya explained in her presentation as well, that might be included into the new standard, and that might change a bit the form of GOs as well. But GO is about information. It's an informative tool. It's a way to distribute information as well, but it is not telling you whether the geo was better than the other geo. So it's up to the organization to view and decide on that. So geo as such does not express any view on this additionality term. So this is just informative tool and tool for information. Okay, I will move to the next slide. And the objective here is to describe for you the arrangement, the setup in Europe. So we have the legislation in place. You have to recognize other member states' guarantees of origin. Well, they have been issued. But we need an additional step to this so that we can enable the market. So we needed a IB hub that can combine all member states together, connect them together, and thus we can transfer the certificates. And this has been necessary even for electricity. And this is an open question for other energy carriers, whether there will be a hub solution created for them as well, and what is the way for the member states to really be able to transfer these certificates. And for gas, we already have a system in place, import-export, but still a question that's open for the future forms. But the hub system has enabled this back and forth transfer between the member states. And once they were issued and created in member states with the same specifications, so naturally it has been easier for the member states, for the registrars to operate, because they know that the specifications for Geos 1 megawatt hour is the same as in their own system. So I want to highlight this, that the system has enabled the whole European market to be there. And how do you get the Geos into it? Well, it is the producers who register themselves to the national systems, their own plants. And one important notification is that it's totally voluntary. Nobody is forced to register their plants at all. This is also one of the background reasons why one can say that this is a very successful voluntary market, because there's no obligation to be registered. And on the other hand, the demand, where does that come from? Traditionally, the starting point has been that to have the suppliers of energy who have branded their electricity products. And I said, the markets have grown and demand has grown even tremendously last few years. So the demand is created all the time. There's more and more demand in different perspectives by different stakeholders. And this is something actually that the standard as well, we want to improve in the standard. So meaning how the GO could be linked to the end product. But these still remain open questions and a bit unclear things as well. But I would say it's the clear point as a starting point to say that I've been using this type of energy, then naturally you also have a GO for it. And it's up to the consumer authorities to make sure whether this bread was produced with renewable energy sources, and there's no clear standard or law on that, but that can be specified further. But this is the idea. If you say that I'm using this electricity and as it's renewable, you always have to have GEOs there. The guarantees must be there, and no matter what the production form is, but what you are claiming to have, and then based on that, you can brand the products you have in place. Let's move to the next slide, please. So these are some numbers for you. When I was drafting these slides, I did not have the latest figures yet available, that I think they've been published this week. So in 2020, you have issues, 100 terawatt hours, and 2020 consumption, 380 terawatt hours. So it means that it's about 1,000 terawatt hours is the size of the market in the European Union area. Growth has been very strong throughout these years, 10-15% annually. But there's one thing that is important to note, even though we talk about sort of absolute or high numbers here, it is still about 1/3 of European electricity consumption as a whole, where you have a GEO in place. So we still have a lot to improve, that we could cover everybody with the system. And we can presume, of course, that the volumes will grow in the future. There are some rather simple factors that explain this, because throughout the last few years, we have large member states joining into this. In 2017, Spain, 20 terawatt hours joining into the system at the same time as the production level, also consumption, I think, as well. It is always hard to say when one new member state joins into the hub. So it's very hard to say whether it's a net consumer or net producer. But as a starting point, people have been considering it's a net producer who enters into the hub and the system. But of course, the total number goes up anyway. Last year, Portugal, Serbia joined in, and Greece as well, and so forth. So the absolute number is growing when the rest of the member states will link into the AIB, this common European organization. And there's one country, I think, which is one larger consumer, Poland of electricity, which is not yet in the safe issuing bodies. But I would say that this is the line of thinking when you have a lot of new producers coming into the system, but we can see in the numbers clearly that the demand for renewables has been growing all the time below these curves. So in particularly demand for renewables and something that you can track down, which is then credible for renewables to see that in consumption. So the whole market did grow. We don't need to speculate at all about this anymore, whether this is the trend or not. It is. Furthermore, as I said already, this is very much based on a voluntary system. This market is based on a voluntary approach. Currently, there's no obligation to join, but this perhaps is not a crazy idea in the future if the European Commission decides that there will be obligations to use renewable energy sources. But the question mark is how you can create the link between GOs, like energy used in buildings, if you have obligations to use renewables in buildings, how you can link it. Perhaps you have to just say that you just need to be using then apply GOs as well. But as you know, European Commission and the directive by nature don't always have links to instruments in a very simple way. Another point is a news highlight from 2020. There are a lot of news highlights saying that renewable energy sources production was higher than the fossils were in the European Union area, higher than ever. But the same news can be said in the format that you have geos, use perspective higher level than ever before, but you don't have any counterpart to measure with because you don't have for fossil sources any geos. So therefore, it's important to keep in mind that some of the headlines you see in the news and some clips is all based on physical market numbers. But GEO is an instrument that is being issued almost respectively to producers. It's been consumed respectively within the window of 12 months' time. So therefore, they don't match or link time-wise together. So it might be for people something that makes them wonder about this. From the market's perspective, when you talk about a lot of about the renewables in the system, hydropower proportion declines every year. Some years ago, we were talking about it being 85–90% of the whole market, hydropower, but today it's about half of it, only 50%. So because we have a lot of wind and a lot of solar power entering into the system, and particularly wind has been the major individual growth area in this system when you see the absolute numbers. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And then the market perspective. We talked about some numbers in the previous slide. And one can also do some, discussion rather than speculation about the prices that you find in the market. There's not just one single price. Geo has always been between 5 cents and 50 euros or €5. So there's no one single price. But it is also about the product being so difficult to standardize. It's like OTC traded commodity because the nature of the information is about where it has been produced. The value can be different for different factors. If a stakeholder finds it's important to have a brand, and from the strategic point of view to get the wind produced locally or something they have already invested themselves into approaching a PPA model, so it might be of different value for them. Geo market price traditionally has been referred to as bulk hydropower in the Nordic countries, so the same price as for bulk hydro pricing. And it is very much the indicative pricing also for other fractions as well. And once I say that the market has been OTC based, by that I mean that the stakeholders use this as a tool. We don't have only one single focus, centralized platform for trading or knowledge of price, but it's a continuous OTC trade between different stakeholders that is taking place daily, and thus you form the price So it's a weekly price, and or the producers want to sell, and the buyers are ready to buy. And as we have seen evaluation or the market developing, there's no longer just the price where you have utilities, large energy products and consumers in place, but there are different sorts of different intermediaries as well, like consultancy companies, trading companies are involved nowadays. So they don't always have a link to the energy supply or selling of the energy that much. It's rather a service business model what they have in place for them to help others to develop their business. So therefore, the market perspective has made the scope wider for the stakeholders. But all in all, the price starting point is that it's always a presumption of how much renewables is possibly coming to the system and how much it will be consumed and taken away annually. So if we have Geos less available, then we presume will be the consumption for that year. One more thing about geo market, as said, as an instrument, it's retrospective. It says what I did consume out from the system. You can still trade this years ahead. Like energy markets are organized usually this way, that the producers and buyers have the opportunity to hedge their price levels on what they want to get out from the production or buy. And the same goes for geo market as well. So you have different contracts, durations are different. PPS agreements can be on the market very long term, like tens of years as for the length, and also for the purchasing. The geo market are also doing trading in the future. It's not only about geos already produced throughout the 12 months, but also the future. And this is something that the standard, new standard, we wish to see there so that there will not be any disturbances to the market created by that. Because geo market is very systematic and well arranged because it has been existing for a long time with a lot of stakeholders who know what the product is, and therefore the presumption is that the market will remain the same even though we have an update or revised standard coming up. So the underlying product will not be hugely, tremendously changed. When the WG5 work group started, the European Commission's representative said that the objective is to make sure that the markets will operate and function in the future, even though the update work of the standard is an ongoing one. But still a bit of a speculation here. From the market perspective, as said, I do wish that there will not be any disturbances taking place with the new revised standard or any other possible ways that might be coming up. One other point in the history that has been influencing the pricing is that the more we have Geos criteria revolving around it and saying whether they have to be something new, is there an age criterion set, should it be of certain country only or certain energy carrier only. So as for these choices, they also narrow down what you can have on the market, and also they might have an impact on the price. But all in all, I think the point here is that Geo as such is not a listed product. It's not a stock listed, but it's more about trading, as said, OTC, where producers and buyers are actively discussing and interacting with one another. Let's move to the next slide, please. So what about the future? What can we expect from this market? And now it will depend on the harmonization. So standard, how the standard will be developed from the European perspective. We can only presume that there is a growth taking place. Something that was made clearly about the Geo is that Geo is also about something, it's political credibility question as well. It has been discussed again as one instrument for the member states to get rid of their own schemes for support, so that we would have only one pan-European instrument in place, and we try to support renewables through that. So credibility and momentum is here present, and it has been accumulating throughout the years. But once you have political momentum into this and credibility into this, there is a danger, at least from our perspective, that we are going to create very complex systems. So at the end of the day, what can you apply for this geo in the future? Will there be some conditions set to it and prerequisites? So that is something that we might have to take into account in the future. And as we think of the trends, you might also say that there are two major trends, but they don't exclude one another at all. They might even be parallel and coexist. One is the harmonization level and volumetric growth. How do they take place? And do we have between all the member states the same style of geos in place, or would there be more like local systems in place like that will be more closed islands even, so that member states want to keep the entity in their own hands? But that would be wrong if you think of the spirit of the directive, because the idea in the directive is that member states are able to trade with all these commodities of renewables. And in the short perspective, any change will be set up by RED 2, which will now be opened up now 2021. That might change for these fractions to the future is in that way unclear. We are not aware of it yet, but the market does not exist yet. So for these other carriers, so therefore it's very hard to say what the future will be for them. And as I said previously, there's one possible scenario which I think will change things, is that if we have some obligations, acquisition or different energy carrier obligations, if I think of organizations like traffic and the mix and the buildings, renewables, obligation, what is the link between that to this system? So there might be very strong, or I would say pressures to change the underlying market compared to today's situation. So I would say today the market situation has been rather simple, but now with the expansion, complexity will grow. So therefore, in 5 years' time, you might have a very interesting market to see what is the status quo in 5 years' time. But I would say that this was my presentation, more or less. So we can now move to questions on my behalf.
I'd be happy to answer any questions. Hopefully we will have some questions. It's always nicer to have a dialogue instead of this monologue. Well, first of all, I would like to ask you, you mentioned stock market, and as the volumes grow, do you see that there's a chance that we someday will see a stock market product? I know there has been such previously in the previous years. Well, two things need to happen before this. First of all, we have to jointly agree on the commodity. What is there? Is it just the GO, or what is it? What kind of a GO, or from where? What's the age? From what part of Europe? It just needs to be a GO for renewables. It cannot have any additional criteria, because in that case we will have so many commodities, like we have the ELSER system in Norway and Sweden. These are issued park specifically, but nobody's actually interested in that. So we need to first agree on this one, and then secondly, whether we are able to persuade to get the buyers to buy, even if they don't know about the origin. So that's the idea. Can we standardize the system so that you just acquire renewables, megawatt hours? If these two can be fulfilled, then we can talk about a stock market product. What it would bring to the market definitely would be that when we're talking about trade between companies and utilities, so the counterpart issues, so-called counterpart issues, can be very critical in the sense that can two companies even meet? Can they trade? Is that even possible? And the idea of stock market would be to centralize all this trading and also to control the counterpart risk. Exactly. Right, this clarified this issue. So we need a more standardized, more further standardized product. We have one question about Poland. Poland and RE certificates, can those be also accepted in Finland? Outi and Mervi know more about this, I would say. Outi, Mervi, would you like to answer this question about Poland and that Poland is the biggest market? That's what Joni said, and that Poland is still not part of the AIB work. Well, we do accept all Geos issued by member states. So for me, I don't know personally these origins or guarantees in Poland, whether there's any reason to doubt that origin. But basically, we do accept all origins, and there's no obstacle for that. And it's not even a question of whether the member state is a part of AIB or not. So, I mean, we can also cancel GOs on some other states' behalf, if possible. Mervi, would you like to clarify this as well? Currently, we do not have a review on Poland or anything such going on. Of course, if this issue would be raised, then they would do it. I don't see any questions for me, at least personally, in the chat. But please, I'd like to just remind you to get in touch if you would like to have any more additional information or like to ask something. I would be happy to help if you don't know enough about Geo, guarantee of origin, the market. So I'd be very happy to help you. Thank you. Thank you, Joni. And let's hear Mervi's presentation about guidance, and then we will take some questions before we finish. Mervi, the floor is yours. Hello, my name is Mervi Suni. I come from the Energy Authority, from the Renewables Group. I will just briefly go through the Energy Authority's instructions on how you can cancel guarantees of origin. I'm sure this is recap for many of you. And if you're not familiar with our instructions, you can find them on the Energy Authority's website. If you look at renewables there, you can find the instructions, and also in Fingrid's on Fingrid's web page, you can find the same documents. And even unofficial material in English you can find. So any questions, inquiries, that these instructions do not give answers to, we would be happy to help you in those cases. And of course, we update the information accordingly. About Energy Authority's task, our task is, of course, to monitor that the Act is followed upon. We also certify and disclose the origin of electricity. We do give instructions, counseling, and we also interpret the legislation if needed for those who are in need of that. We publish our instructions every year annually by the end of June. And if states come with any requirements, we do some reviews based on that and based on the current legislation. Here's a list of energy authorities' various instructions. This regulation on guarantees of origin was updated last summer, 26th of June 2020. We did some minor changes to texts, and also the calculation method changed from transaction-based method to a new model, new method, and we had to change also the information accordingly. What's important here is the clarification for the energy authorities instructions for certifying disclosing the origin of electricity. This is from 2016, and it says that we recommend a procedure in which the electricity supplier cancels the guarantees of origin for electricity it has sold as renewable in its own name, and then the seller can also mention against what the cancellation has been made. And then I would also like to mention that the Energy Authority will also get new tasks with this new legislation. And now that as we are working on new instructions, new regulations, so these current instructions will be looked upon and revised. And as for electricity, the nuclear question is of course important and interesting, and that will also definitely be subject to revised instructions. I'm sure of that. Let's take the next slide, please. So here we have some clarifications and some examples from the actual document. And for example, in example number two, the text is quite small, but I will tell you what they are about, so you don't need to read them through. But anyway, example one here, this is the basic idea that when an electricity supply A sells to its customer X electricity, these guarantees are cancelled in the register, and then the customer X can verify that the electricity it uses is renewable by means of an agreement on the purchasing of electricity. And there's an additional field where you can put the name of the customer X. We have received some questions on this. For example, how can I be sure that I have purchased renewable energy generated from renewable sources? How can I be sure of that? Like Joni, the previous speaker, said, we have a law in place and we have authorities who are monitoring and following up on the situation. So in the big picture, the idea is that this system is so thoroughly monitored and checked upon, so that the end users can be sure that if they purchase renewables, they also get them. In some cases, the supplier has also submitted an example of a cancellation certificate, how it looks like. So in some cases, it might be a good solution that creates a trust in the system. We're also thinking about some communication methods on how to make sure that everybody can rely on the system and can trust the system that it actually delivers what it promises. Let's take a look at the next slide. Here's example number 2. And like I said, please don't try and read it through. There's a lot of small text. But here's the same picture as in the previous slide. The same mechanism is actually here. We have A, Y, B, and X, different components. We have electricity supplier A that sells electricity that is renewable in origin to both electricity supplier B and its own customer Y, which is the electricity end user. And then we have a purchase agreement as a proof of renewable energy in case the customer wants to use that. So A sells a certain amount of renewable energy to B, and the B seller then sells it further to his client. And therefore we have X, customer X also in the picture. And then customer A has made the cancellations on behalf of customer B. So in both cases, cancellations have been made. As for notification of Geo, so the A, customer A, can notify the amount that has been sold to Y, and also notify the amount that has been sold to B as residue mix. And also the B, customer B, can notify the amount that has been sold to X. Let's take the next one. That's actually my last slide. Recent instructions or policies. We have answered questions and inquiries, and we do that mostly in written form, because many times we need to also get additional information ourselves, and we also interpret the law, legislation and statutes and our own instructions and guidelines. So therefore any quick fix answers are probably not what we can provide, for example, on telephone. But of course, we always try to provide answers as soon as possible. But I have included here a few examples on the questions that we have received. Some general questions that might be of your interest as well. For example, if you want to have guarantees, if you want to have cancellations of guarantees from for a specific wind park, there's a field that you can fill in for that in order to express your desire. Then we have also received questions on whether trading guarantees of origin is reportable wholesale electricity trade under the REMIT regulation. Well, the answer is mostly a no. But if an agreement could fall within the scope of REMIT reporting, it can be if it's fixed price, including guarantees of origin in addition to energy, and it is classified as wholesale market products and it's resold by the company's customer. So in those cases, it's possible. And then there's one who was asking whether it's possible to cancel the whole production amount in Finland if there's consumption somewhere else in Europe. Can that be cancelled only in Finland? And the answer was yes, that's possible. You can only cancel the consumption made in Finland. I have also included a reminder here. The reminder is that cancellations for 2020 should be made by the end of next month, end of March. And for those maintaining the register, it's of course very good to do that by the end of March, and it's also good for the whole system, and also to make sure that we have residual mix in place as early as possible. And on the last slide, I would just like to thank you on our behalf. And there's also our emailing address where we would be happy to get your inquiries and questions should you have any. There's still a lot to do in order to fulfill the new legislation and requirements. So therefore, it's also very valuable if we can get any ideas and comments on the current status so that we can also update our instructions. So we'd be very happy to receive any comments, ideas or questions. Do we have any questions at this stage? Yes, thank you, Mervi. We do have one question. Is it possible to cancel the GO without defining the receiver so that you can do it in the future if that is needed? If you cancel a guarantee, you need to as far as I know, you need to do it, you need to cancel it yourself on your name. So technically it's not possible to do it on behalf of someone else. So if you cancel a guarantee, you have to do it yourself and use your own name for that. Thank you. And then we have another question still. This is about the new law, new act. According to that, the new guarantee is invalid 12 months after production or from production. GOs for previous year, can those be cancelled during the current year if the GO is valid at the time when the cancellation is in place or is valid? So the consumption year and the production year do not need to be the same. That was the question. No, the consumption year and the production year do not need to be the same. We do get some last minute cancellations quite often, so it's not uncommon to cancel last minute before the validity runs out. Right, these were questions concerning cancellations, and let's move forward.
We'll come back to the other questions that we had. Boris the OT, are you able to answer this question? This is in English. It's about the legislation. What is the purpose of Geos in nuclear electricity? So the question is why Geos also been issued for nuclear power? Well, the consideration is that here, nationally speaking, yes, there's a need for that in Finland. so that we are able for the consumers also get some transparency. So transparency of selling this electricity product if the market claim is that this product is either emission-free or saying that this is directly produced with nuclear power. Currently, today, we have several sellers of electricity who sell these products, saying that these are specifically produced with nuclear power. So therefore, we consider that there's something we need here in Finland. Okay, thank you for that. And could you please also answer this next question? This was something we received during your presentation. Could you please specify, so Odi, please. Odi, could you please specify how to handle GO in the situation where the wind power has been produced to produce hydrogen to produce electricity in another situation or other place? Can, in that case, the wind power get GO, but also the hydrogen produce electricity as well? So I think the question means that the wind power comes from the grid to the renewable hydrogen production unit. Right. So if the situation is such that we take from the grid the wind power produce electricity in order to produce hydrogen, in that case, in order for the hydrogen to receive a GO, you have to cancel the GOs of the renewable energy source. And if furthermore you produce from the hydrogen electricity in another place, again, you have to do that with the GOs. So the hydrogen COs have to be cancelled for the electricity, then they can be issued. So what is the starting point? Is a wind power electricity at the same site where you produce hydrogen as well. So then in that case, only hydrogen could be issued the GOs. No need to sort of a grant there in between that GO for the electricity itself. I think from the administrative point of view, it makes sense if they are on the same site. What else? What are the other questions we have? There's a question on statistics. Do you have annual statistics on how much geos have been applied for different energy carriers in Finland? So how much water, solar, multiple fuel plants, etc. Kirsi, are you able to answer this question, please? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Could you please repeat the question? Yes, it's about annual statistics. So how much geos have been applied for different forms of energy, meaning hydro, wind, solar, and multiple fuel plants, and so forth. Unfortunately, I can't remember by heart, but about 32 terawatt hours is what we have granted in the register. You can see this in our statistics from our website, please. So if you can go there, you can see the energy carriers there, but I don't remember by heart. Okay, I think the question was, do these statistics exist? So on our website, yes, they do exist. Yes, they do. Okay, so you can find both production time, a moment, and also per transaction time, both. Yes. Yes, occasions all the transactions they are there. And the same statistics can be found from the website of AIB, Association of Issuing Bodies, for all member states who are in that AIB. So per month, I would say even, and then annual reports, yes. Okay, good. This is what I thought as well. But I think we have now seen all the questions that we have received in the chat box. So I'm just checking, just making sure that that is the case. Well, there is one more question. In power plants, they have biomass fuel sustainability system. Do they, in that particular plant, have to, for electricity or heat, it's heat, okay, heat, you need in the future get Geos for that heat to be able to consider that it is produced with renewables? Yes, if in that case you sell that to the customer as renewable, so yes, you have at the beginning of next year the obligation for guarantee, and you have to cancel guarantees origin to make sure that you then sell that heat that way. But then the geos that you cancel, it doesn't need to be for that particular plant. So of course the producer, if wants to, the producer can make a choice there, not to have them for their plant, but purchase them from outside. So buy guarantees of origin to be cancelled. Okay, thank you for that. Right, and this was that question. I think now we have a short survey, a poll for you to reply, a screen.io questionnaire. Bente, could you perhaps take the lead here, please? Yes, hello, I can do that. So you see on the screen an address online, and you can use your phone browser or your computer browser. There will be a screen showing up asking for passcode, and you write there GO, and you can access to this questionnaire. So just a moment, I'm rearranging my windows on my computer. Here we are. So you should now see on that website that you access using your browser, you should see the questionnaire, what kind of weather you have over there. How is the weather? So please click any, what is the right option for you. So answer that, how is the weather question, so we can see whether everyone has answered or that many of you have been able to access. So I see a couple of dozens or a few dozens of answers so far, yes. So this is just an exercise question for you, so that we see that people have accessed this questionnaire. So this is not the real question. The real questions will be following this one. Okay. We'll just wait a short moment till the people access this. And I see the number is growing as for participants on the questionnaire website. Okay, so I was about to say that we can now show you the screen of the questionnaire on the main screen of presentations. So I think there are some technical issues here. No, I think we managed to get it now. perhaps it's not going to open up. No, it doesn't look that it's going to work. So we did test the system, yes, but it's not working right now. We wanted to ask some questions about cancellations and about the market, but Pentti, perhaps you take over the host position. I think I might be able to do it here. You should be able to see it now. I hope that you can all see a view with only the questionnaire on it, I hope. So let's move to the next question, which is the actual first question. Do you presume that the share market will grow with the new act or bill? Okay, so no more votes or answers. Let's move to the next one then. It's about the same topic, so open comments. So any comments, please, you might have on that topic, and you can still see the questions on the other side at the same time on your phones or on the browser. So you can go back to other questions if you're a bit behind, if you're not yet at the open comments. Let's see if we can see some comments. So any comments, please? Okay. Okay, I see there are now some comments there, which is a good thing. So there are a couple more questions, so let's move on before we run out of time. So the next point or question, do you think there is a need to localize further? So is there a need to issue certificates earlier than today? And you have some options there. So I think you have now answered. So I see we have, I think, more or less equal number of answers as we have participants online. So I think we need to be finishing now because we are running out of time. Very interesting results there on the screen. Yes, and I think this was the most essential question out of all the questions. Thank you all our speakers, and thank you also all interpreters and decision makers and participants, and thank you Adato and Passa Maria there, and thank you Kirsi and Bente as well, and have a very nice spring. Thank you. Goodbye.